Hello Chipmunk and Chipette fans, my name is Grandy Tamias, the speculative evolved species of upright walking chipmunk, and today I'll be counting down the top 5 best things that could come out of Bagdasarian possibly selling Alvin and the Chipmunks. But before I get into that, I would like to mention that this video, unlike my previous top 5 list, is scripted, so this one is going to be a lot longer because I'm going to have more to explain, and not necessarily because the reasons I give this time are better than the reasons I had last time. I would also like to address a few things from the comments of my previous videos, because many of you seem pretty divided on what company should own the Chipmunks. Those in support of Disney argue that they should buy the Chipmunk franchise to go along with the film rights that they had bought in the Fox deal, which would thereby open up the possibility of finally getting a 5th entry in the live-action film series that started under Fox in 2007. However, even if Disney did buy them, there are many other factors that make it unlikely that they'd revive that film series, but instead reboot it. But I'll save further details on that for a video I have in the pipeline. But if you've known me on this channel for a while, you know how I feel about Disney as a company and their buying habits. I just wish they'd go back to the time, like, before they bought Lucasfilm. A surprising number of you think that Viacom should buy them, despite what I said about that company potentially posing a threat to the Chipmunk fanbase with their tendency to copyright strike anyone using parts of their content and or making fan content in ways that other companies are more lenient about. It's bad enough that we can't voice our opinions about the CGI series because of those thin-skinned cowards at PGS. Viacom's strategy is hurting themselves and would us. No wonder Paramount hasn't been doing so well. Most of you in support of Viacom think that it'd be a good idea because their subsidiary Nickelodeon already airs the CGI series. And to that I ask, so what? Nickelodeon is just one of many networks around the globe that airs the series. To name a few others, in France it's broadcast on M6, Easy Tunes in South Africa, and Disney Channel in Spain and Japan. In fact, the CGI series seems to be doing better internationally than it is in its homeland United States. For the past 3 seasons, it's been a semi-regular thing for countries like France and the UK to get episodes several months in advance of their US release. So while I find it more likely that Bagdasarian would sell to an American-based media conglomerate, or at least one with a large US presence, they wouldn't sell to Viacom just because one of their subsidiaries airs the CGI series in a region where it's not doing as well. Nickelodeon would have little, if any, impact in that decision if Viacom buys the franchise. Besides, I don't like the idea of Alvin and the Chipmunks being treated in the same ballpark as Nicktoons like SpongeBob, The Loud House, and the likes. Not only are the Chipmunks above the level of Nickelodeon-style humor, but they've also existed for decades longer than Nickelodeon, and would just seem out of place. But that's just my opinion. Unfortunately, after 2 months now, we still lack any update on the sale of the Alvin and the Chipmunks IP following the original CNBC article. While I wouldn't drop my suspicions and worries just yet, I would like to give the benefit of the doubt and discuss some of the more positive things that could come out of this. Because as much as I respect the Bagdasarians, I think they've been too cautious to do certain things with the brand that they should have done a long time ago, or haven't due to a lack of resources like that of a media conglomerate. So let's get into the countdown. Number 5. Crossovers with other properties. I went over this in regards to Nicktoons just a moment ago, but I would like to add on that the reason that we have not seen Alvin and the Chipmunks in crossover works like Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl is not just because Nick and therefore Viacom don't own them, but because Bagdasarian would likely be opposed to their characters fighting or being fought against. I went over this in my video game elaboration, so check that out if you're interested. As for the other big studios and conglomerates, in this day and age, they love to include as many of their IPs into one film as a way to cross-promote them. As much as I'm sure many of you would love to see the Chipmunks in the MCU, that would require Disney buying them, and, well, you get it by now. But maybe they could cross over with DC if Warner Brothers buys them. In that case, forget Batmonk, we can have an actual Chipmunks and Batman crossover. Although Warner Brothers is in the process of merging with Discovery, so that may factor into things. Or heck, I mentioned Hasbro in one of my previous elaborations, so maybe the Chipmunks could share a universe with the Transformers. That'd be so cool! Maybe Alvin could go out joyriding with Hot Rod, or Simon could make inventions with Wheeljack. Seriously, I'd pay to see that. Okay, fantasy's over, moving on. Number 4. Untapped Potential. Like I said, Bagdasarian has been very cautious about what they do with the Chipmunk IP, and don't tend to take a lot of risk, both in terms of merchandising, which I'll get into later, and the stories told in the cartoons. Focusing on the latter, this franchise is primarily character-centric as opposed to something like Star Wars, which is more about its concept and has a big universe that doesn't rely on following one character or group of characters. I don't want to get too far off track with this, as it kind of relates to what I've talked about before with the possibility of more chipmunks and other stuff like that I want to talk about in the future. But I would like to see Alvin and the Chipmunks experiment with different genres and do things that can add to the history of the franchise instead of just sticking with the tried and true formula. I want to see new tweaks and additions to the Chipmunks' universe and its presentation that could go a long way to become staples of the franchise in the future, like establishing a new origin for the characters, although that would require continuity and lore, which they should have more of anyway. They could also borrow elements from previous series, but use them in a way that serves the narrative first and foremost. Speaking of future iterations, number 3, a more impactful reboot. The perception of the franchise in the 21st century has primarily been defined by the Fox films, so much so that not a lot of people know the name Bagdasarian or associate it with the Chipmunks. Ask any millennial on the street what they think of this franchise and they'll be like, "Oh, Alvin and the Chipmunks? Those terrible movies made by Fox?" Because other than the original 1958 Chipmunks song and maybe the passive knowledge that the Chipmunks used to have cartoons in the 60s and 80s, not much about this franchise has carried through the ages. And the current CGI series, while being a good show in my opinion, has not really been as successful at keeping the franchise relevant these days. In fact, Nickelodeon in the US has essentially been doing the bare minimum with the show in terms of new premieres. There are at least 2 instances of the show having gone without new premieres in the US for nearly 10 months. Think about that. A human child could have been conceived and born in that time, and there were no new episodes of Alvin and the Chipmunks. And this in large part accounts for what I was saying before about other countries getting episodes much earlier than the US. But that's another thing I'll have to continue on about in another elaboration, the decline of the CGI series. Once the series is over, we need a reboot that gives audiences a reason to keep coming back to watch it, other than status quo antics. Plus, with the resources of a media conglomerate, it could be better advertised and cement itself in our pop culture, and perhaps overshadow the bad memories of the Fox films. Number 2, more merchandise. For the past few years now, chipmunk-related products around the world have been on the decline and are not generally promoted or stocked at mass retail. Not only would a media conglomerate be able to manage licensing of the Alvin and the Chipmunks brand out to so many other companies, but they would also be able to make sure that those products are promoted along with whatever chipmunk media they're accompanying. There really aren't that many notable toy lines in this franchise, as I covered in its own dedicated elaboration, so like I said, if a company like Hasbro were to buy them, they'd make sure that they deliver on both the entertainment and the toys. And finally, number 1, release of Bagdasarian's back catalog. Once again, depending on who buys the Chipmunk IP, we could see episodes of cartoons that have not been officially re-released since television reruns decades ago, or re-releases of their albums, many of which do not have their songs available for download anywhere. Ross Bagdasarian Jr. mentioned in an interview over 2 years ago that the entirety of the Alvin show had been digitally remastered and that they were waiting for the right time to re-release it, but that hasn't happened yet. Considering how many of the potential buyers have streaming services, I'm sure they'd love to add more animated content to their libraries. Just hopefully they use uncensored, unaltered, restored versions of episodes from their original broadcasts. Like I said, the 80s cartoon in particular had some pretty questionable moments that would not fly by today's censors, so if they're that concerned, most streaming services offer the option to have separate profiles now, which can limit the library to just children's content, so if they're that concerned, they should just put the censored versions on the children's profile and leave the uncensored ones on the standard adult profile for longtime fans who value the true way to experience these cartoons. How hard is that? There is still a crowd of people who enjoy the history of animation, and Alvin and the Chipmunks have been there for some of the most important times of it. The 60s and 80s Chipmunk cartoons are time capsules that show the amazing way that this brand has evolved over more than 6 decades and can still bring joy to kids generations later. We need these cartoons in full again, because even if this franchise keeps reinventing itself, it can't go on as if anything it did before didn't matter. But that's where I'm going to stop. And there you have it, 5 silver linings to the possibility that the Alvin and the Chipmunks franchise could be sold. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you can think of any more good things that could come out of this, or if the reasons I gave outweigh the negatives. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't, follow me on Twitter and Discord, and leave suggestions for future video topics. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.